We made it through the first week of the new Trump administration. And when I tell you I have whiplash, I have whiplash. There's been a lot that happened this past week, and I'll be breaking down all the executive orders and how it could affect your immigration journey. So stick around for that. I heard someone say the other day that this is not Trump 2.0. This is a Trump 1.0 because in this administration, he literally has no guardrails, right? There's no one there that is telling him no. There's no adults in the room. So we have every single thing that he wants to do. There's no one saying no to him. So he's able to, get Congress on board, get his people, his cabinet on board with these things. So we're going to be talking about each of these executive orders, what it means for you moving forward, and how you can keep protecting yourself while all these immigration changes are happening. And they are happening very fast. I am U.S. immigration attorney Lilian Chukwurah, and I help my clients get green cards and citizenship for themselves and their families using the U.S. immigration law system. As of January 24th, 2025, we have had 13 executive orders come out. The first one is more of a rescission executive order. So it basically rescinded every single executive order related to immigration and other areas that the Biden administration did. So any executive order that former President Biden signed, Trump has rescinded. So we are in a place where anything that was in effect that was an executive order is now over with. And that is big because there was a lot of different things in immigration that was done by executive order. And now those things are gone. A big example of that is the parole for the Haitians, Nicaraguans. Like those parole programs are now gone because they were done by executive order and not actual legislation. The second executive order is the executive order protecting the meaning and value of American citizenship. This executive order seeks to end birthright citizenship in the U.S. for certain people. The first group of people affected by this executive order ending birthright citizenship are children that are born to parents that are not U.S. citizens. So if the mother is in the U.S. unlawfully and the father is not a U.S. citizen at the time of the child's birth, the child will not be considered a U.S. citizen. Secondly, if the mother is in the U.S. under lawful status, but it's a temporary status like a visiting visa and gives birth, and the father is not a U.S. citizen or permanent resident at the time of the child's birth, the child will not be considered a U.S. citizen. So that's what they want to do. That's the provisions they want to add to the constitutional amendment that says that anyone born in the U.S. is a U.S. citizen. That has been in litigation now. So the ACLU was able to file a lawsuit, and with that lawsuit, the judge in that case actually put a hold on this law going into effect. So this executive order at the moment is not in effect. So unless something changes between now and February 20th, nothing is going to change. Okay, so if you have a child today, your child is still a U.S. citizen. So there's no change in that law because it has not taken effect yet. However, if you've watched my other videos, I talk about how ending birthright citizenship needs a constitutional amendment. And in order to do a constitutional amendment, you need Congress on board. And well, he was able to get a congressperson to file a bill to basically do a constitutional amendment, making his executive order now part of a constitutional amendment to the birthright citizenship provisions. So we are going to be seeing Congress debate this and go through votes, and the lawsuit is still going on. because of the executive order, but now we also have to look at the bill trying to pass Congress. And if it passes Congress, you know he's going to sign it. So we're going to keep an eye on all of that as it goes on. But just know this is not the end of it. We're going to be hearing a lot more about this birthright citizenship issue. The next executive order is the executive order protecting the American people against invasion, right? So the first thing that you need to know about this executive order, it is wide ranging. It covers a whole bunch of things. So let's talk about the immigration specific parts. The first thing is it wants DHS, so the Department of Homeland Security, to basically get rid of the Biden administration priorities for deportation. So under the Biden administration, they had a limit of these are the people that we're going to make a priority to try and get deported from the US. Under the Trump administration, they're saying no, there's no priorities. Everyone is fair game. It is about maximizing enforcement of immigration law. So they are getting rid of any sort of enforcement priorities. Second thing this executive order does, that's very important to know for immigration purposes, is that it expands the expedited removal process. So who can be caught into the expedited removal. So typically when you're coming into the US through a port of entry, you are subject to expedited removal. All right, if you're flying into the US, if you're going through a US land border that is a designated port of entry, you are subject to expedited removal. With this executive order, they are expanding the definition of expedited removal and who can be removed through this process. So I will get into the actual definition of that in a few. The third thing this executive order tries to do is call for registration of undocumented aliens and the prioritization of enforcement against those who do not comply. So basically, they would want anyone in the US that is undocumented to go through a registration process. And if you do not register, you would not be an enforcement priority. And here's the key language in this that I really want people to understand. So it says, as well as, so not only are you going to be an enforcement priority if you do not register under this provision, it's also saying that you can, they can levy fines and penalties against the people who are undocumented and others who facilitate the presence of someone who is undocumented. Now, what does that mean to facilitate the presence of someone that is undocumented under this executive order? We do not know, right? Would an immigration lawyer that's assisting someone through the immigration court process or assisting them to legalize their status, would that be facilitating the presence of someone who is undocumented? So we do not know what that is going to look like in actual practice, but as we learn more, I will bring you more. Now, what we can get from this is we don't know how to facilitate the presence of someone who is undocumented is going to affect, individuals, but we do know how it may impact governments. So state governments, local governments. If they are a sanctuary city, a sanctuary state, will that affect them? Most likely. So in those situations, if a sanctuary city is not willing to cooperate with the enforcement by ICE, the federal government can levy fines and penalties, and that may look like not funding the state, not giving them federal funding for certain things. So it is one of those things that we have to keep an eye on, but it is a provision of this executive order, and immigration is one of those places that the president has a lot of room to act, and it can have wide-ranging impact on not just individuals, but on state governments as well that choose to prioritize their immigrants over the federal government. The next executive order is the executive order securing our borders. So this is also a wide ranging, but it focuses more on humanitarian things like asylum, parole, things like that. The first part, basically eliminates asylum at the southern border. Under the Biden administration, they had the CBP1 app where people that want to seek asylum in the US can make an appointment, and a officer can basically gauge whether they have credible fear. And if you have credible fear, then you'll be allowed to come into the US and seek asylum. And if you do not, you will not be allowed to enter the US. So that was the process under the Biden administration. They're taking that completely out and going back to the previous MPP process, which is like the remain in Mexico. The only problem with the MPP is that Mexico's government has to agree to it. And if Mexico does not agree to it, this is going to cause a huge crisis for the immigrants trying to come into the US and seek asylum. The humanitarian program that was created by the Biden administration for certain countries, including Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba, those are going away. Those have ended. If you have an application pending, just know it's not going to be processed. It is done. But also, on top of that, although that humanitarian program is being ended for those countries, the ones for Afghanistan and the ones for Ukrainians are not being touched, right? Even though these humanitarian paroles have proven to be effective in limiting the number of people entering through the southern border, entering the country without authorization, this is going to be a big shock for people, especially people that either already got approval to travel and now are getting notifications that those are canceled. That is going to be a big shock to people. So the effect that we can see with ending the CBP1 program and the humanitarian program for these specific countries is that we may see more people entering the US without inspection, without going through a legal port of entry. So it is going to have the opposite effect that they think it's going to do. Because these were legal pathways for someone to be able to enter the US and seek asylum and adjust status based on family if they have an immediate relative in the US. This was giving people options that were legal pathways. And now, by taking those legal pathways away, you are creating a situation where there may be a higher surge in people trying to enter the US without going through a port of entry. The last thing that this executive order does is end catch and release, which is basically a process where CBP officers will find someone that's entering the US without inspection and without going through a port of entry. They can hold the person, process them, and then release them pending their immigration court hearing. The Trump administration wants to end that. So what would happen is if they catch someone, instead of processing them and releasing them into the US for them to then go through immigration court proceedings, they would be detained. So this will expand mandatory detention for people that they catch trying to enter the US. So again, when I said in my previous video about mass deportation, that it's really mass detention because they have to detain people and then process them to determine if they can actually be deported or if they need to seek asylum in the US. So it's going to be a whole mass detention that we are going to see before we see any actual deportation of new migrants or people that do not already have a removal order. The next executive order is the executive order declaring a national emergency at the southern border. The reason for this executive order is literally for the government to use the Department of Defense, the Army, the National Guard to do immigration enforcement. Okay, there is no other reason that they are declaring this national emergency except for the fact that the president can now use the military to do his immigration bidding. Here's the problem though. Typically, the Department of Defense is about defending the US against foreign enemies and, not immigration enforcement. So typically civil immigration enforcement. Immigration enforcement is civil, not criminal. The next executive order is Executive Order protecting the United States from foreign terrorists and other national security and public safety threats. So that's the next one. And this one is basically going to end up turning into a travel ban. Okay, this is the same language they used on the Muslim ban when they had it in the first Trump administration. So basically, within 60 days, the administration will identify countries with deficient vetting procedures that will be subject to a complete or partial travel ban. So we're going to find out in 60 days what countries are going to be on those lists. Do I expect there to be litigation on this? Yes. The government will be sued on this as they were last time. And then the next thing here with this executive order, so it's not just that they're trying to figure out which countries to add to the travel ban list, they're also going to increase vetting, so enhance vetting of people applying for any immigration benefits. This is going to result in longer wait times. Okay, that's what that's going to result in, whether it is people applying for status in the US or people applying for visas outside of the US, the waiting time is going to go up. And if your country ends up on that travel ban list, you may not be able to get a visa to the US. So we're going to be keeping a close eye on that. So we have 60 days to figure out which countries are going to be on that list and plan accordingly. Next one, executive order designating cartels and other organizations as foreign terrorist organizations and specially designated global terrorists. So this is basically saying that cartels are now a terrorist organization, and if you were part of the cartel, you were you are now considered a terrorist. Okay, so basically, with this executive order, there is a process to designate cartels as foreign terrorist organizations, and that is typically going to be done within 14 days and calls for their complete elimination from the US. This means if the US government thinks that you are part of a cartel, whether they have, stronger evidence of it or not, they can use this executive order to detain you until they have evidence that you are not part of a cartel. So now cartels are considered terrorists under this executive order. This order relies on the determination that there is a qualifying invasion to justify the use of the Alien Enemies Act. They don't need it to detain and deport people. However, by designating cartels as terrorist organizations, they can use that to say that it qualifies as an invasion to then be able to trigger the Alien Enemies Act. They are doing some legal gymnastics here to make this work and fit within that definition so that they can use that as a way to detain and deport more people. And remember, if they are able to make this legal gymnastics work, it means that they can deport people with or without giving them an immigration hearing. The next executive order is the executive order guaranteeing the state's protections against invasion. So again, we are looking at the Trump administration trying to say that there's an invasion happening to the US and it's coming from the southern border, and they are going to do everything in their power to stop migrants from coming to the US. And this includes migrants that are coming to the US to seek asylum. Okay, so they are using this to justify their suspension of all border entries. So if you're flying into the US, you can still fly into the US. However, border entries, so driving into the US, is shut off right now. This order is being based on the premise that undocumented immigrants entering the US is the same thing as an invasion. So in order for the president to have these rights and powers to do certain things, they need to be able to show that there's an invasion. And by designating the southern border a place where immigrants are just flooding through and causing an invasion of the US, and using this to say that they are protecting the states of the 50 states from foreign invasion. Is that really what's going on? No. But again, legal gymnastics is happening here, and it is only going to get worse, especially if Congress gets involved and tries to make these things into actual laws passed by Congress. So the legal gymnastics are only getting started. The next one is executive order clarifying the military's role in protecting the territorial integrity of the United States. This is basically saying that within 10 days, the Department of Defense is ordered, right, to deliver a revised unified command plan for the United States, which basically will say how they will handle unlawful mass migration, narcotics, human trafficking, all of that. They have to present that plan within 10 days of that executive order. And the order also requires them to have a commander's estimate within 30 days and continuous assessment of operations. So basically, this is saying the US military is now going to be very involved in US immigration enforcement, right? Immigration enforcement is civil, it's about people in the US, but this is now going to be part of the military's role according to this executive order. So the next one is the executive order realigning the United States refugee admissions program. So with this executive order, there is a pause on refugees being able to enter the US. Remember, refugees are people outside of the US that has been designated by the UN as refugees. So these are not people coming to the US to seek asylum. They are already designated as refugees and they have been vetted. Vetting for refugees can take up to 2 years, if not more, for them to verify your identity, verify that you are who you say you are, and that you are from that country. They do extensive background checks for refugees. So for the Trump administration to make it seem like this program is just letting anyone into the US is a farce, okay? It is not what is actually happening here. So there is that suspension. And until that suspension is lifted, we will not know how many people will actually be allowed to enter under the refugee program. It says that within 90 days, the Department of State and the Department of Homeland Security will offer recommendations to the president about resuming the program. However, it is going to be up to the president whether to resume the program or not. So even if DOS, Department of State, and DHS, Department of Homeland Security, says, yes, this program should be resumed, it's still up to the president to decide whether to resume it or not. And also how many people to let in through the refugee program. That program under the first Trump administration went down a lot. The amount of people allowed to enter the US was very, very low. So we will see what happens with this. The next one is the executive order, America First trade policy. This is going to highly affect employers and businesses because if the U.S. is reevaluating their trade with Mexico and Canada and other countries, we are going to see some changes on the TM visa, which is specifically for Mexico and Canada, and the other trade-specific visas like the E1 and E2. So if the U.S. reevaluates these trade agreements and changes the provisions when it comes to the visas that are part of these trade agreements, we're going to see some of those visas and visa types going away. So this is not good for business in the US. However, this is something that the Trump administration has been talking about and are pushing. One of the biggest things that will have a huge implication for undocumented immigrants is the expansion of expedited removal. Typically, expedited removal is used by CBP when people are trying to enter the US through a port of entry. And when they look at the person's paperwork, if it's not in order, they can remove the person immediately without them having to go to immigration court, unless they have credible fear. Without that finding of credible fear, the person will be removed, hence the term expedited removal. By expanding expedited removal, there's going to be more people that will fall under this category, and the US government can remove them without necessarily having to put them in immigration court proceedings. The people that will fit under this are aliens who did not arrive by sea, who are apprehended anywhere in the United States more than 100 air miles from a U.S. international land border, and who have continuously present in the U.S. for less than 2 years. So anywhere in the U.S. and you have been present in the U.S. for less than 2 years, you are now subject to expedited removal. Secondly, aliens who did not arrive by sea, who are apprehended within 100 air miles from a U.S. international land border, and who have been continuously present in the U.S. for at least 14 days, but for less than 2 years. So each of these categories of people will be placed in expedited removal under this executive order. This is very important because that means literally wherever you are in the US, if you are undocumented and you do not have documentation to show that you have been in the US for at least 2 years, you will be subject to expedited removal. Something else to keep in mind with this is because the court system, the immigration court system is part of the Department of Homeland Security. They are letting their attorneys know that when a case can be subject to expedited removal, but it's in immigration court, the government attorney can actually dismiss the case from immigration court so that the person will be put in expedited removal process. So, with this new executive order and the policy memo that was sent out to the government attorneys, this means that no one that has been in the US for less than 2 years and is undocumented is safe. And if you came in with a parole and that parole has been rescinded or ended, just like the parole for Haitians, Nicaraguan, Venezuelans, those paroles are ended. So if you are under that and you've been in the US for less than 2 years, you could also be subject to expedited removal. So please, if you think you may be subject to expedited removal, speak with an attorney. Make sure you have documentation showing that you've been in the US for at least 2 years and have that with you at all times because you never know when you may get into contact with ICE because they are enforcing heavy right now. So we really want to be as safe as possible out there. So that is everything, almost everything that happened in week one of the Trump administration. We will continue bringing you updates on the new executive orders, policy memos, whatever it is, because we know there's so much more to come and you need information. And that is a wrap on everything that happened immigration wise on the first week of the Trump administration. We will continue bringing you updates. As you know, there's lawsuits, there is potential legislation to end birthright citizenship. So we will continue following all of those things to make sure that you are staying informed. If you are in a place where you may be subject to expedited removal or you are undocumented in the US and you do not have a family preparedness plan yet, please watch my video from last week so that you can make sure that you have things in place for your family in case you are picked up by ICE. If you would like to schedule a strategy session with me, please do that by going to my website, literallegal.com, and clicking on Contact Us so you can pick a date and time that works best for you for us to chat. Thank you all so much for watching this, and please stay safe out there.